Good morning. Today's title couldn't be more fitting for what's going on in just personal lives of people around us, as our prayer list indicates. Meanwhile, God is at work. Can we trust that this morning? Can we trust that God is at work? And though we might have our plans and things we want to do, God is always at work in our lives. I told my wife this morning, I said, when I wrote the introduction to this sermon, as a pastor, you always want to have personal experience. You want to have personal experience so you can relate to the people, so you can pull from that personal experience. We want that, but we don't want that. The first line I have written down here says, life doesn't always go according to our plans. Yesterday I'd planned to go up to Abbott to visit Janet. I didn't make it. God had other plans for me yesterday. I don't know what was going to happen on the way up there, but I was fine. Last Sunday, my neck was sore. I slept wrong. When you get older, you'll understand. You go to bed, you wake up, things hurt for no apparent reason. Well, we call it we slept wrong. How do you, apparently we need a class on that when we get older. How do you sleep? But, it's like, okay, I went and played pickleball. Some of our pickleball champs weren't there to play, so I had to step up and fill in. I played pickleball. Everything is fine. Go out through the rest of the week doing all kinds of stuff. Everything's fine. Yesterday morning, I go to get in my car. I can't look left. I thought, okay, well, I can get around that. I can't look left. No problem. That won't stop me. I've got plans. I'm going to carry out my plans for the day. So I leave Main Street, fine, talking with everybody there, standing up, having a good old time, laughing. Everything's going great. I get to the church. I reach for something. The pain hit me so hard and so fast that I almost passed out. So my plans changed, wait to the emergency room. I went instead. Now, either way, I was going to be in a hospital. I had this worked out. That hospital, this hospital, I worked out. So I was there. But then I was there when Teresa came in. Teresa was out at the lake having a good time with her grandkids, and then they hit a wave on a raft and it dumped them over. Well, she's got little grandkids, so she's trying to help them and get them to stay afloat. Even they were wearing life jackets, but she was helping. And it was that struggle in the water is what they believe kind of led to her having a heart attack. Once again, when we get old, we got to remember we can't go to bed, and apparently we can't play in the water like we used to either. So, and she is okay this morning. She is at Mankato. They've done some tests on her. They've allowed her to eat now, and they're going to do, I think, an angioplast tomorrow. They just want to be 100% sure that that's what it was and nothing else. So they just want to be 100% sure before they let her go. So she was out at the lake with her grandkids, having a good time, and then, that's not how she planned the rest of her day to go and her weekend to go and this week, but, that's the plans. And God interrupts our plans. Roger was at work yesterday, just, working, being trained and all that. And then he started getting lightheaded and dizzy and going to pass out. He had an hour left in his shift. That's not how he planned on his day to go. But we all met we had a little family reunion there at the emergency room, just... So, life doesn't always go according to our plans. The first line, and I'm like, I think I had plenty other examples I could have pulled from. I didn't need this one, but we'll see how this goes. However, if all of a sudden I drop down and I start praying, y'all just join me in prayer. When the pain stops, I will get back up and we will continue. So, and, if I just start saying stuff off the wall and everything, it's the pain meds talking, so. But, it doesn't go the way we plan. Sometimes we face unexpected turns and heartbreaks, delays. And when it feels like our story is unraveling, Scripture reminds us that God is still writing our story as we continue to live our lives and we make our plans. And I know what is a fool makes plans in his heart, but God leads his steps. I think that's the proverb, if I quoted it correctly. And that's the truth. We make our plans. We kind of try to decide what we want to do in our lives, but then God steps in and He directs us the way He wants us to go. And I always point out, if you're doing what God wants you to do, you'll have less pain in your life. But if you're trying to go against God's will, He's going to keep trying to bend you back to that straight line. And a lot of times we cause all of our own pain and suffering, and yet we'll blame God for that when God's just trying to get us back on track. So this morning, we're going to step into the opening chapters of one of the Bible's most powerful narratives. This is a lot of people's favorite story in the Old Testament, the story of Joseph. Because we see in the story of Joseph a lot of the parallels between Joseph and Christ. It gives us a glimpse of how God uses pain and suffering in our lives to put us in a place where He wants us to be. And we got to trust in those times in the valley that God is still there. That meanwhile, God is still working in our lives. But before I get to his story, we got to go through chapter 36. Now, this chapter reminds us about the God who writes generational stories. And a lot of this chapter 36, it's God's sovereign hand in generational stories. And we see here in a chapter that most people would skip over. You come to this section right here, and it shows you like a genealogy of Esau. What is important about Esau's generations? What could we possibly do to this chapter except butcher names? But this chapter actually has a lot to tell us about God's work and how God is working behind the scenes. Because God also promised both Jacob and Esau that they would become nations. In Genesis 25-23, when their mom, I'm not going to go for the name. Their mom is giving or getting close to giving birth, and she feels the babies inside of her fighting. And she asks God, what's going on? And He says, you have two nations inside of you fighting over you, or fighting inside you. And she says that kingdoms will come from both of them, yet the younger will rule over the older. And so we see that God had promised before Esau was ever born that Esau was going to be a father of a nation, that kingdoms were going to come from him. So even though God promised that Jacob was going to be the promised child and that Jacob receives all the blessings of God, He's also going to bless Esau as well, and God is going to keep His promise to Esau. Esau's family becomes Edom. He will become the nation of Edom. He'd be wealthy and powerful and organized. Verse 31 tells us that these were the kings who reigned in Edom before the Israelite king reigned. So before any other of the Israelite kings are mentioned anything, before Saul, before David, before Solomon, Edom had kings, had their own nation growing. The Israelites are going to go into captivity for 400 years. And Edom is going to prosper. But we saw that Edom was kind of already prospering as Jacob was coming across to meet that Esau was already called Edom, and he had land and he had animals, and he didn't need any of these gifts that were given to him. So God was already blessing him before. So even those outside the covenant family, like Esau, are not forgotten by God. This chapter shows us that God keeps his word. Can I blame that on the pain meds? God keeps his word to both the chosen and those on the margin. The LMW commentary points out this, that earthly success isn't the same as spiritual blessing. We look around and we see all the people that publicly say that they don't believe in God. And yet they are prospering. They are living in large. They've got everything their heart could want and more. And then we're like, we trust in God to take care of us. We are faithful to his word. Why are we not being lifted up like they are? Why can't we have what they have? Well, the first thing I point to is we're told not to lust after, not to want what our neighbor has. So there's that. And then the second thing is, I feel sorry for them on the spiritual sense, but on the other sense, I want them to have all that. I want them to have the money. I want them to have the fame. I want them to live it up here on earth. I want them to have everything their hearts desire. I begrudge them nothing. Because this is it for them. That's it. They got this life. If they don't live it up in this life, they don't go. We're going to go to heaven. We're going to suffer down here and go to paradise where we will have everything we could want. And for eternity, they're going to have a few years here on earth. We see that in Esau's descendants. They prospered here. They became kings. And he had nations. But as you read through this genealogy here, none of them are prophets. None of them are priests. There's no mention of God anywhere in this section. We're just told that Esau was blessed. That God kept his word to Esau. So even though Esau was not following God, God still kept his promises to him. We see that in the entire book of Obadiah. Did y'all read that? Was it this week? No. Last week we finished the book of Obadiah. It was one page, one chapter long. And that whole thing, though, it's a prophecy and a judgment against Edom for its pride, its violence against Israel, and its arrogance against God. Obadiah chapter 1, of course, verses 3 through 4 declares, it says, "The pride of your heart has deceived you. Though you soar like eagles and you make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord." It's a sobering reminder that earthly success without submission to God is temporary and ultimately leads to ruin. So while they're having that great time down here, where are they spending eternity? Would you rather have riches here and have all that and not trust in God? And enjoy your time here? Or would you rather live for eternity? Maybe you don't have all those things, but you have eternity in heaven with your Father. We have to trust that God is in work in every generation, both within your family and beyond. His promises stand. His hand guides history, and his purposes reach farther than we can see. While Esau's line seemed to rise swiftly, it would soon be forgotten. Because unless you're here in church today, nobody talks about the kingdom of Edom. Does anybody know what's going on in Edom today? Do the things that are happening in an Edom concern any of us today? Are we really worried about Edom? Does anybody know where Edom is located on today's map? I'd have to look it up. We hear nothing about Edom. Where's that? Okay, Petra. So yeah, in that area. So that's where Edom would be at. But yeah, I mean, unless you know your history book or anything like that, you don't know where Edom is located anymore. We don't talk about Edom anymore, but we sure are really concerned about what's going on in Israel these days. We know where Israel's at. You know, we know all that, and Israel was following God. But now, as we turn the page into the next chapter, the story, it slows way down. We bring our focus back, not to the nation's rise, but to one young man's fall and God's providence through it. Because I think as we read through the book of Genesis, you really need to keep in mind that Moses wrote this book. Moses was writing this book in the desert as they were wandering for 40 years. Because the Israelite people that had been in captivity for 400 years wanted to know where all these people came from. How did it all begin? How did it all start? So God gave Moses these words to explain how everything began. And that's why we see the focus comes in. We start with the world, and then we come into a family, and then we kind of expand again to what's going on in the world, and then we'll come back, and we'll go back in, and we'll go to a family, because it's more important to them where they came from. But he's also trying to tell them the world around him. So now as we slip into chapter 37 here, we'll turn to Jacob's son Joseph. He is a 17-year-old boy marked by favor. Read verses 1 through 11 real fast. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending his flock with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zippah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons of his sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told this to his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph, a young 17-year-old boy, and God has marked him for favor. God is showing him what's going to be happening in the future through his dreams. But Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And then he made him an ornate robe for him. This robe, long-sleeved and ornate, marked Joseph as a manager, not a laborer. It fueled his brother's resentment. Israel raised up Joseph in the eyes of his other kids. He showed favoritism and didn't even try to hide it at all. Give him this robe, letting him know that he has elevated him over all of them, and that they are basically to obey him, that he is the manager of the property and everything that's going on. They are to report to him. I can only imagine how that galled his older brothers, that they would have to come to their younger brother and make an account for everything that's going on in the farm. And that robe would have just made it even more, because now every time they see him, it's just rubbing salt into that wound. And then Joseph, he comes out and he says, he tells them about a dream that they're binding sheaves of grain, your sheaves gathered around mine, and bowed down to it. And then he doubles down even more when he tells them about the next dream. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. As we read through that, his brothers hated him. Then they hated him all the more. And they were jealous. God was revealing Joseph's future to him. But it was Joseph's immaturity and sharing them so boldly that stirred that deep resentment. God sometimes reveals his purposes early in our lives, but then he develops character before he fulfills them. Sometimes the dream arrives before we're ready for the responsibility. When I first started school, I had to take a class called Introductory to Ministry. And I had to record 3 15-minute sermons. Never delivered a sermon before, and I recorded it and I sent it in. And my professor, he sent something back, and he said it was the best first sermon that he'd ever heard. I was like, okay. And I did my next one, and I didn't hear nothing back. Well, I was like, okay, well, apparently there was only one way to go from there, and I took that path. I did my third one, and he just sent me back. He said, "Are you looking for a church?" Well, that's what I'm going to school for. It's kind of, yeah. He knew of a church that was looking for a pastor, and he was going to endorse me for that. But I just started school. And even though I'd been a Christian my whole life, and I've read the scriptures, and I study, and I was teaching a class, even at that time, I knew that I was not ready for the kind of responsibility that it would take to do that. So I started the process. I sent them an email and everything, and you know, like, meanwhile, God was working in the background because they didn't get my email and they didn't send me the stuff back. So I filled that out. and back. But then I was like, I'm not ready. I need more time. I need to be more mature in my faith to know what is going on and to be able to convey it to others. And so that's what God does to us a lot. He gives you that desire. He gives you that want. And that desire and that want pushes you forward in your goal. And you have to have the maturity level not to kind of rub that into the face of other people and cause problems for them as you're pursuing your goal. And I think that's something that Jacob or Joseph really wasn't looking at. He was just like, I'm daddy's favorite. No, I had this dream. And he's kind of giving digs at his brother. But you can't help but know that his brothers were getting upset at him. How could he not know? It says they couldn't even speak a kind word to him. So he had to know that there was problems between him and his brother. But as long as his daddy is on his side, he's safe. And he knows that. So he can continue to rub this in. But Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us that there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. So if God has placed a calling or a burden or a vision on your heart, trust in his timing for that. So now I want to look at the jealousy and the sin of Joseph's brothers. And it's in 12 through 28. It says, now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing in the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. So he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, all he found was a man wandering around in the fields, and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on the way to take them down to Egypt. Judah saw his brothers. What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. The brothers had been growing in hatred. In verse 5, verse 8, then verse 11, becoming more and more upset with their brother. And I can't help but wonder, what Israel was thinking, sending his 17-year-old son out into the field to check on his brothers by himself. Verse 18 says, "But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him." Now, I don't know about you guys, but there are people that are alive in this world because lack of opportunities. Plenty of motives, no opportunities. The brothers looked up and saw Joseph walking towards them all alone, way out in the distance, and said, "Hey, we have no witnesses. There's nobody to see what we've done. We can finally rid ourselves of this little brother that thinks he's going to rule over us. We'll see what happens to God's word if we kill him." But even in this, we see that God was working in the background. Because you see that Reuben, the firstborn son, is trying to take control of the situation. He's stuck in the middle between his other brothers, and they're furious in hatred of Joseph, but also not wanting to break his father's heart. He says, "Let's not kill him. Let's throw him into the cistern." Makes me wonder if he knew it was empty to begin with, because, that could have been full of water, could have thrown him in, and he could have drowned. But they throw him in that cistern that had no water in it, and they left him in there. And they could have wandered off and left him there, and he would have eventually died. But, no blood on their hands, because all they did was beat him up and throw him in the cistern. Reuben was going to come back and rescue him later, but the other brothers didn't know that. But instead of killing him, Judah steps up and says, "Hey, we won't get anything out of his death. We can make some money off of this. So we'll pull him out and we'll sell him into slavery. He'll be gone. We'll never see him again. And we make a little money." And of course, this is a point where you might think about Jesus and how he was sold for 30 pieces of silver. Inflation for the price of a slave here. We got 20 here. That was the going price of a slave. And then Jesus sold for 30 later. So in a little bit of inflation. So he sells them off. As God is working through all this, he uses their hatred and he uses their jealousy to get Joseph where he needs him to be. Joseph needs to learn some valuable lessons if he's going to move forward, if he's going to be able to bring the people out of Egypt, if he's going to be in a leadership position. He needs to learn some things. Maybe sometimes it's better to not tell your brothers that you're going to rule over them, and maybe your mother and father. Maybe sometimes it's better to just keep your mouth shut. That goes for everybody on Facebook. Sometimes it's just better not to say it. Right. We make enemies all the time just doing that. We don't know, people may be out to plot against you. The circumstances may turn against you. But God's purposes in your life are never thwarted by human schemes. God will use all of that in your life for his glory. And this verse just keeps popping up everywhere I look. I think it's trying to tell me something. Romans 8:28 reminds us that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Even betrayal becomes a bridge to blessing when God is sovereign and involved. So now we have Joseph that has been thrown into a pit, dug out of the pit, and then sold into slavery. So I don't know if he went from worse to better to worse. But he's alive and he's going into slavery. But now we have the cover-up and the deception of Jacob. Verses 29 through 26, the kids are coming back home, and they've come up with this elaborate story. They've taken Joseph's coat and dipped it in animal's blood and brings it to their dad and says, "Is this your son's?" Doesn't say, "Hey, this is our brother's coat. We found this along the way. Is this your son's coat?" Jacob naturally is distraught over the loss of his favored son. I really don't want to kick a man while he's down, but the commentaries do, so I'll just go ahead and fill that in for you. Genesis 37:35, it says, "All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. In mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." Just a few short chapters back, Jacob's father felt the exact same way when he gave the blessing to his non-favored son. He was distraught and upset that he had been deceived in such a way. And here we have the son that did the deceiving, being deceived himself and being brought down in a grief that mirrors the description he once committed against his own father. When we sin, we do something illegal, we do something to gain something in an immoral way, it often comes around full circle and will get us in the end. We have to be mindful because deception's harvest always comes home. Galatians 6:7 warns us, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." But even in grief and consequences, God's providence still is at work. And that brings us to one of the most hope-filled words in this chapter. Meanwhile. God is working, because meanwhile, verse 36 says, "Meanwhile, the Mennonites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard." Joseph has been stripped of his coat, removed his authority from over his brothers, thrown in a pit, beaten first, then thrown in the pit, and then he was sold into slavery. In all that, God was working to move him to Egypt, where he needed to be. He's not only moved into Egypt, but he's sold into Potiphar's house, one of the highest ranking officials under Pharaoh. And yet Joseph gets moved into that particular house because that's where God needed him for his plans coming up. When life unravels, when betrayal stings, and grief seems endless, and when it feels like the story is over, remember this. Meanwhile, the Mennonites sold Joseph into Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Meanwhile, Jacob mourned while his brothers lied, while Joseph was bound and alone God was not absent. He was not indifferent, and he was not done. He was moving the pieces of a larger story. We know the end. We know the story of Joseph's life. He has no idea what's coming next, but we do. We know that God is working. If someone could go back and read the story of your life and know it from front to end, to be able to tell you, hey, I know this hurts now, but just wait, what's coming next? You can get through this because you know something greater is coming. Wait a minute, there might be a book that tells us that. I have a copy if anybody wants to borrow it. Jacob couldn't imagine. One of the brothers couldn't control. And here's the hope for you today. God is writing your story too. What feels like a dead end is often the hallway to the next chapter. What feels like defeat is often the doorway to deliverance. Then God, who carried Joseph into Egypt, or the God who carried Joseph into Egypt, is the same God who carries you. And even when your dreams seem dead, even when the pit is deep, and even when the grief is raw, He is still sovereignly working for the good of His glory. Matthew 29:16 says it well. With man, this is impossible. But with God, all things are possible. If you believe this and are able to, stand with me, please. So hold on, church. Trust Him in the silence. Believe Him in the sorrow. And wait for Him in the wilderness. Because the God of Joseph is still on the move. And just as God uses Joseph's suffering in many ways, or in many lives, so He would one day send His Son, betrayed, rejected, and crucified to save the world. Meanwhile, it's hard. It's hard to go through pain. It's hard to go through struggles. It's hard to go through life not knowing. I think that's the toughest thing. None of us knows what's going to happen. I got up yesterday morning. Everything was great. I was going about my job. Meanwhile, God was working in the background, saying, you have no idea what today has in store for you. I have plans that are bigger. We'll do it my way. And through shooting pain, I agreed. God is working in our lives all the time. We have to look for God in every situation and know that even if it's hard, even if it hurts, God is still with us. God is sovereign over everything and working for our good. We're going to go into the time of decision and prayer. We're going to sing a song. If you need prayer of any kind, you're hurting, you're going through something, and you want us to pray, please come forward during this song.